She could never have imagined what would happen after my actions. She begged, cried, accused, but I had nothing left to give her. For now, let's start from the beginning. I sat there, my eyes fixed on her, waiting for the gravity of her words to sink in. She stood with her arms crossed, chin slightly raised, radiating a confidence that suggested she fully expected me to crumble beneath the weight of her ultimatum. Obey me or forget any hope of intimacy. It wasn't the ultimatum itself that cut the deepest. It was her unwavering belief that this ploy would succeed, that I would break, beg, or at least scramble to prove myself deserving of her affection. That was the instant everything became clear. This wasn't a simple argument fueled by the heat of the moment. It wasn't a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. It was a pattern, a carefully masked cycle of control dressed up as ordinary marital conflict, and I had played my part in it for far too long. A laugh escaped me, genuine, amused, the kind that bubbles up when faced with something so absurd it barely seems real. For a split second, her eyes widened in surprise, but she quickly hid it behind a scowl. "What's so funny?" she snapped. I leaned back, letting the last threads of amusement fade as I met her gaze. "Perfect. Keep it forever." Silence followed. She blinked, likely waiting for me to backtrack, to soften my words, or to offer some explanation that I didn't mean it. But I wasn't angry. I wasn't even hurt. I was simply done. Rising from my chair, I took my phone from the table and quietly walked out of the room. No shouting, no theatrics, just a calm, decisive exit. For the first time in our relationship, I felt no need to justify myself. I didn't care to argue for her understanding or attempt to prove her wrong. Let her sit with it. Let her realize her tactics had finally fallen flat. I entered the bedroom, gathered a pillow and blanket, and moved silently into the guest room. No slammed doors, no passive-aggressive remarks, just space. And she didn't follow, not right away. She likely assumed I needed time to cool down, that within an hour or two I'd return, apologize, and try to patch things up. Maybe she believed I'd attempt to negotiate, to compromise in exchange for the intimacy she dangled like a prize. But she had nothing left that I wanted. Lying in the guest bed, I stared at the ceiling, letting the clarity of it all settle over me. I wasn't afraid of losing her. I was relieved. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, feeling lighter than I had in years. The tightness in my chest was gone, replaced by a calm clarity. No sinking feeling gnawed at my stomach. No weight of responsibility to mend what she had broken. When I entered the kitchen, she was already there, seated at the table with her arms folded. Her expression was expectant, as if waiting for me to address the events of the night before. I calmly poured myself a cup of coffee and sat across from her, completely composed. She cleared her throat. "So, are you done acting childish?" I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting her words linger in the silence between us. Then a small smile crept onto my face. "Yeah, actually I am." Her eyes narrowed, confusion flickering behind her gaze. She was expecting a fight, a plea, some form of negotiation. But none of that came. Instead, I finished my coffee, stood up, and walked away. That was the first crack in her confidence, the first subtle sign that something had shifted. She didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of the end. The silence unsettled her. For years, our conflicts followed the same tired script. She would push, I would resist, she'd escalate, and eventually I'd give in, either by apologizing just to end the confrontation or by surrendering to her demands to avoid another prolonged fight. But not this time. I gave her nothing. No reaction, no anger, no attempt to repair what couldn't be fixed. I simply stopped engaging. I went about my day as if nothing had transpired. I left the house without offering explanations and returned without seeking her out. When I spoke, my words were brief, neutral, and drained of emotion, and she hated it. At first, she pretended not to care, rolling her eyes as I walked by without acknowledgement, scoffing at my silence when she made her passive-aggressive remarks. But soon the cracks began to show. Her first real sign of panic emerged when she tried to provoke me. I was in the living room scrolling through my phone when she entered and sat heavily on the couch across from me. She didn't speak immediately, just sat there, waiting for me to notice her presence. When I didn't, she let out an exaggerated sigh. "So this is how it's gonna be now?" Without glancing up, I responded, my voice flat. "What are you talking about?" "You, this whole ignoring me thing. You think this is normal?" Finally, I met her eyes, calm and detached. I'm not ignoring you. Oh, really? Because it sure feels like it. I shrugged. I'm just done wasting energy on useless conversations. Her jaw tightened. Oh, I see. So because you didn't get your way, now you're throwing a tantrum? That actually made me laugh. A tantrum? I was calmer than I had ever been. She wasn't used to this version of me. She was accustomed to me trying to mend things, taking responsibility for problems she had created. She thrived on having the upper hand. But now she had nothing to grasp onto. The real shift came later that evening. She stood by the sink after dinner, clearly waiting for me to speak. I could feel her desperation, the growing unease radiating from her. Normally, this would have been the moment I caved, where I'd try to patch things up and pretend everything could return to normal. Instead, I calmly picked up my glass of water, took a sip, and walked out of the kitchen without uttering a single word. That was when she finally understood. She wasn't in control anymore. The silence between us became routine. It wasn't a pause, it was a complete transformation in how I approached my life. I had nothing left to say, nothing left to argue for. But for the first time in years, I had someone new to focus on. Myself. I didn't make grand announcements. There was no dramatic speech about turning my life around. I simply began living differently, without her approval, without her validation, and without hesitation. The first step was fixing my sleep schedule. I abandoned the restless nights spent replaying every argument, trying to predict the next inevitable clash. I went to bed early in my own space and woke up clear-headed for the first time in years. Then I joined a nearby gym. Nothing extravagant, just a simple place where I could lift, sweat, and rebuild myself from the inside out. The first week was brutal. Every muscle ached in ways I hadn't felt in years. But I welcomed the pain. Each sore muscle was a reminder that I was making progress, that I was reclaiming control, something she could no longer manipulate. She noticed, of course. I could feel her eyes on me as I returned from workouts, drenched in sweat, my breathing still heavy. At first, she acted indifferent, but I saw the way her gaze lingered when I grabbed my gym bag or downed a protein shake. I began dressing better, not for her, not for anyone else, but for myself. I threw out old clothes I had kept for far too long and replaced them with things that made me feel good. I got a proper haircut, no more lazy trims just to get by. When I looked in the mirror, I started recognizing myself again. Then I started going out. At first, it was just the little things, grabbing coffee alone, going for walks, reconnecting with old friends I had lost touch with over the years. But gradually, I started living again. I accepted invitations I would have once declined, visited bars, and met new people. Each time I stepped out the door, I felt a little freer. The more I focused on myself, the less space she occupied in my mind. And that's when the panic set in for her. She was losing her grip on me, and she knew it. At first, she tried to act as if nothing had changed, feigning indifference. She rolled her eyes when I left the house, made snide remarks about my gym routine, and scoffed at my new, well-fitted outfits. But I noticed the cracks in her confidence each time I didn't react. Then the shift began, subtle, almost imperceptible at first. One evening, as I passed by her to grab something from the kitchen, she brushed against me, a touch that hadn't happened in weeks. A few nights later, she lingered in the doorway of the guest room I had moved into, leaning against the frame as if she had something to say. But the words never came. She just waited, hoping I'd invite her in. I didn't. Then came the escalation. One morning, as I was getting ready to leave for the gym, she spoke in a voice that was almost soft, fragile. You've been spending a lot of time away from home. I tied my shoes, grabbed my bag, and met her gaze. Yeah, she hesitated. Doing what exactly? I smirked. Living. That hit her. I saw it in the way her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to retaliate but couldn't find the words. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was meant to be the one in control, the one making me desperate for her attention. Instead, she was left watching me walk out the door, wondering where I was going, what I was doing, and most of all, who I was with. The power she once held over me, gone. Desperation crept in. One night as I stood in the kitchen, she suddenly appeared beside me, leaning against the counter, her fingers tapping too casually against the surface. It was forced, too deliberate. You know, she started, her voice tinged with something dangerously close to desperation. We don't have to keep this up. Things don't have to be like this between us. I didn't respond. The silence weighed heavy between us. She edged closer. I miss you. That was new. I turned my head slightly, meeting her gaze. Miss me? I repeated, as if the very idea was foreign to me. She nodded, her fingers tentatively tracing a path down my arm. The same woman who once wielded intimacy like a weapon, holding it above my head as leverage, was now offering it freely. I let her touch linger for a heartbeat before gently pulling my arm away. Without a word, I grabbed my glass of water and left the room. That was the moment she knew she had lost. But surrender didn't come easily to her. After I withdrew from her touch that night, something inside her shifted. The facade of indifference she had maintained early on completely vanished. Now she was fully in damage control mode. She started trying again, this time with more determination. It began subtly. She would linger around me more often, as if it was mere coincidence we shared the same space. She'd sit closer to me on the couch by accident. She'd ask hollow questions, feigning interest in my day, an interest she'd never shown before. When none of it worked, she escalated. One evening, as I prepared to go out, she leaned against the doorway of my room, no longer ours, and silently watched me adjust my watch. Going out again? Her voice carried an edge of forced nonchalance. I didn't bother looking up. Yeah. With who? A smirk tugged at the corner of my mouth as I straightened my sleeves. Does it matter? That stung. I saw the flicker in her eyes, the way her fingers tightened against the doorframe. I just think it's strange. You never used to go out this much. I finally turned to face her, my expression unreadable. Yeah, I never used to do a lot of things. She stared at me, waiting, hoping for some sign that I wasn't slipping away for good. But I offered her nothing. I grabbed my keys, brushed past her, and left without another word. The control she once had over me, dead and buried. Somewhere deep inside, she must have realized she had lost me. But instead of accepting it, she made one final desperate attempt. Guilt. A few days later, I came home to find her sitting at the table, her eyes downcast, fingers nervously twisting together. I almost walked right by, but before I could, she spoke. Can we talk? I sighed, knowing exactly where this was headed. Still, I sat down, resting my hands flat on the table. Go ahead. She hesitated before exhaling a shaky breath. I don't know what's happening between us. I raised a brow. Really? She ignored the weight of my tone. I don't want to fight anymore. I tilted my head slightly, waiting for what would come next. This isn't a fight. It's just reality catching up to you. Her eyes flickered, a spark of panic breaking through her composure. It doesn't have to be like this. We can fix things. I know I haven't been perfect, but stop. She flinched, not because I had raised my voice, I hadn't, but because I wasn't following the script she had played out in her mind. I exhaled slowly and leaned back in my chair. You want the truth? She nodded, her eyes searching mine, as if this was her last hope to turn things around. I don't want this anymore. Silence fell between us. Her lips parted as if to protest, but no words came. I leaned forward, my voice steady and calm. I don't hate you. I don't even care enough to be angry, but I see you for what you are now, and I'm done pretending this marriage is anything more than a cage I let myself live in for far too long. Her breath hitched. So that's it? You're just giving up? I shook my head. No, I'm finally choosing myself. I stood, walked to the counter, and picked up my phone. As I dialed a number, her eyes widened. When she heard me say, I'd like to schedule a consultation with a divorce attorney, something inside her broke. But by then it wasn't my problem anymore. She cried, she pleaded, she tried every tactic to sway me, but it was too late. Once the divorce process began, she oscillated between two extremes. Some days, rage consumed her. She hurled accusations like they could undo everything. Other days, she painted herself as the victim, acting as if I was the one abandoning her. Neither approach worked. I had nothing left to give. The best part? I didn't feel guilty, not even for a moment. The old version of me would have wrestled with doubt, second-guessed every decision, wondered if there was anything left to save. But now I felt nothing but relief. I moved out before the paperwork was finalized, packed my things in silence while she stood in the doorway, watching. This isn't fair, she whispered. You're just walking away like I meant nothing to you. I zipped up my suitcase, turned to face her with an unreadable expression. No, I'm walking away because I finally realized I meant nothing to you. She opened her mouth to respond, but I didn't wait. I grabbed my bag, walked past her, and left that house, our house, for good. Life after her, it was better than I had ever imagined. I got my own place, a space that was finally mine. No tension, no manipulation, no walking on eggshells, just peace. I kept working out, kept improving my appearance, and kept saying yes to new experiences. I met new people, went on dates, not because I needed to prove anything, but simply because I could, and I thrived. Meanwhile, she didn't. Mutual acquaintances let it slip. She wasn't handling the divorce well. She was unraveling, putting on a show of composure while everyone around her could see the cracks beneath the surface. She had spent so long controlling me that she never considered what would happen when I was no longer there. Now she was the one who was drowning in regret. I never looked back. Not once. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want her to suffer. I didn't even care what she did because I was free, and that, above all, was the main thing. Our story has come to an end. I have selected 2 more videos that I think you will enjoy. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot.